Good afternoon, everyone. Thank you so much for joining us this afternoon for our final installment in our Visions of Reproductive Justice series. Today's webinar, Reproductive Rights at the Margins, Injustice in Immigrant Confinement, is co-sponsored by the Center for Immigration Law and Policy and the Center on Reproductive Health, Law and Policy at UCLA Law. Today's webinar will run from around 12:15 to 1:30 p.m. We'll begin with a conversation between our two wonderful speakers, and we will have some time at the end for questions from the audience during around the last 15 minutes of the event. So if you do have a question for our speakers during the event, please use the Q&A function at the bottom of your screen. As a reminder, this webinar is also being recorded and will be made available after the close of the webinar. So with that, I am honored to introduce Ahilan Arulan-Antham, Faculty Co-Director at the Center for Immigration Law and Policy, who will introduce our speakers for this event. Welcome.
Thank you so much, Carly. Before I do the introductions, I'd like to start by acknowledging that this event is taking place both over Zoom and on the traditional, ancestral, and unceded territory of the Gabrielino Tongva peoples. That acknowledgement feels particularly appropriate for this event, which is about a government policy that jails people, including pregnant people, while determining whether to permit them to enter US territory. So our event today will be a conversation between two extremely interesting people doing really important work. Tina Vasquez is a senior reporter and editor-at-large for the online journal Prism, where she leads their coverage on gender justice and workers' rights. For more than 10 years, she has reported stories at the intersection of immigration and reproductive justice issues. Before joining Prism, she was a research director at Political Research Associates, and before that, a senior reporter at Rewire News, where she was actually their first immigration reporter and started the beat sort of from scratch. Tina is based in North Carolina, and we're really excited to have her with us. One thing I'll say sort of on a personal note before I continue, I first came to know of Tina's work. We'd never met before today, but I came first to know of her work from her really excellent coverage of the Trump administration's mistreatment of pregnant mothers under its zero tolerance policy, the so-called zero tolerance policy, and some really disturbing attempts of Trump administration officials to prevent pregnant teenagers, often victims of rape, from getting access to abortion while they were in the custody of the Office of Refugee Resettlement. It's a really awful chapter among many awful chapters of Trump administration immigration policy. And in an interesting twist, I knew about that because I was working at the time with Melissa Goodman at the ACLU of Southern California, who was litigating a challenge to that Trump era practice. And Melissa has just joined the Center on Reproductive Health, Law and Policy as its new director. And Tina did some truly phenomenal reporting on the work that Melissa was doing during that time period. So it's sort of all coming full circle. Today, Tina will be speaking with our very own Monika Langarica. Monika is a staff attorney at the Center for Immigration Law and Policy here. She's based in San Diego. Monika was born and raised in the borderlands and has devoted her whole career, now more than 7 years as a litigator, to doing immigrants' rights work. Before coming to UCLA, Monika did impact litigation at the ACLU of San Diego for 3 years. Before that, she did direct representation of immigrants facing deportation at the ABA Immigration Justice Project in San Diego. And she now leads the center's litigation on a range of issues, from the due process rights of asylum seekers to the scope of nationwide injunctions and various others. Most important for today's conversation, Monika has extensive experience representing immigrants held in detention centers, which is to say jails, run both by Customs and Border Protection, or CBP, and also Immigration and Customs Enforcement, or ICE. And for the last 3 years, she has done a lot of advocacy, including through the administrative complaint systems run by the Department of Homeland Security, to challenge the way CBP treats pregnant and postpartum mothers in its custody. And that, I think, is a good jumping off point for the conversation. So I'm really looking forward to hearing from both of you, and take it away.
Thank you so much. Thank you, everyone, for joining us. Monika, I'm very excited and nervous to be talking to you because I'm a very big fan. But I was wondering if a good way to start would maybe to do a little bit of grounding, because I feel like since Roe versus Wade was overturned, it seems like a lot more people are familiar with the reproductive justice framework. But for those who aren't, I found that it's maybe helpful to walk through like what reproductive injustice looks like. So kind of in the context of CBP custody or like detention more broadly, what does reproductive injustice look like, or how does it take shape for immigrants who are detained?
Thank you so much, Tina. And thank you, Ahilan, for that introduction, and to our audience for being here. I'm also nervous, but very excited to have this conversation with you, Tina, given your extensive reporting and experience on with a lot of these issues. I guess I'll start by saying in a very general sense, and to zoom out for a second, this may be obvious to others who are close to the issue, but to me, spaces of confinement are inherently sites of reproductive injustice, because where people don't have the freedom to exercise bodily autonomy, that is to say, where people don't have the freedom to decide or to do what is best for their bodies in a particular moment, that to me is reproductive injustice. And so, with that frame in mind, I'll start the conversation off by saying that kind of injustice manifests in immigration confinement in a number of ways. It can look like, sexual assault by guards or by people within those prisons or facilities who have control over the movement of people within them. It can also look like something that you know a whole lot about, Tina, because of your reporting on it, but it can look like places or like exposure to forced sterilization and other non-consensual and unnecessary gynecological procedures performed on people, again, in these spaces where they do not have control over their bodies or full control over their bodies. And I'll also say, to get us started, that it can also look like the inability to access both adequate and humane medical treatment for people with reproductive health needs. And so, this can look like an inaccess that results in really tragic miscarriages for people who intended to take their pregnancies to term. It can look like something else that you've reported, which is the shackling of pregnant people. And then, of course, it can also look like the inability to access abortion care or contraceptive medications. But I'll leave it there and I'll pass it back to you for now.
Given everything that you just outlined, this is going to sound like a silly question, but I have found that when we talk about reproductive justice, we often don't talk about immigrants or women who are detained. Why do you want that to kind of be at the center of this conversation around reproductive injustice and reproductive justice? How do you see it as what women experience when they're detained? How is it relevant to this broader conversation or broader understandings that we want people to have about reproductive justice?
Yeah, I appreciate that that question. As I was getting at this, to me, the denial of bodily autonomy and the fight against that denial is at the heart of the fight for reproductive justice. But as I was mentioning, these spaces of confinement, including immigrant detention centers, are inherently places where people are denied bodily autonomy wholesale, right? And as I mentioned, this can look like extreme examples like lack of access to abortion care or sexual assault, but it can also look like the inability or the denial of somebody's ability to respond to their body's very basic needs, right? Like knowing when it's time to sit down for a meal, or when it's time to go for a walk or stand in the sunshine, because only you know when your body needs those things. The people in detention are denied that kind of freedom routinely, every day, on a regular basis. Every minute that they're in those facilities or in those prisons, they're subject to somebody else's control over their movement. And I think it bears noting that immigration confinement is a particular brand of this kind of imprisonment that the US government imposes on people for doing things like seeking asylum in this country or fighting to remain in the United States with their families. And it's a system that exposes people to indefinite periods of detention, such that somebody can be locked up for months and even years at a time without knowing when they'll get out, or even if they'll get out and be able to rejoin their communities or families in the United States. And that's the context in which many of these injustices occur. But so for me, the critical point here is that when we make concessions, when we're willing to make concessions for a particular segment of the population, we make concessions for the whole movement, right? So when we normalize, when we carve out a segment of the population and we normalize for that segment, any treatment that is less than our full vision for reproductive justice for all of us, be it because they were born in another country, or because they're locked up, or because maybe they did something we don't agree with, in my view, we inevitably chart down a path of normalizing that kind of treatment for the movement and for the rest of us. And to me, that's something that we just cannot allow to happen. So it's critical for me that that this conversation, at the very least, include spaces of confinement like immigration detention.
I've never heard it quite articulated that way, but that's a very strong argument for why immigrants should be kind of at the center of this. I very much want to talk to you about this campaign that you've worked on for many years now about the treatment of pregnant and postpartum people in CBP custody in particular. But so we're kind of all on the same page. I think things kind of get flat and we call everything ICE, right? But what do you want people, before we jump into CBP, what do you want people to know about different forms of confinement under different agencies? Are there distinctions you think are important for them to kind of be aware of?
There are, and I'm very happy to answer this question. So, to start, I'll say the Department of Homeland Security is the, big federal agency that has authority or jurisdiction to enforce immigration laws in the United States, among other things. DHS breaks up into, multiple component agencies or sub-agencies, and as you noted, the one that we often hear the most about is ICE, or Immigration and Customs Enforcement. And that's, because ICE has control over long-term immigration prisons. They, are charged with what they call interior immigration enforcement, so the enforcement of immigration laws throughout the United States. And so as a result, they have a presence, throughout the country, and it's what a lot of these conversations about immigration often engage. But so I'm at UCLA today, but I'm based, as Ahilan mentioned, in San Diego at the US-Mexico border, in the US-Mexico border region in San Diego. And like in many border communities, I would say that we have a comparable, if not greater, presence of Customs and Border Protection, or CBP. And so CBP is the agency within the component agency or the sub-agency within DHS that has control over border enforcement. And stay with me for a second, but CBP breaks down further. And so CBP, the two big components I'll focus here on is they have the CBP Office of Field Operations. And those are the officers who staff official ports of entry. So they wear navy blue. They're who we hand, our passport or visa or lawful permanent resident card to when we're seeking to enter the United States, whether it's like at a land port of entry or at an airport. That's the Office of Field Operations on one side. And on the other side is the U.S. Border Patrol, which is a component agency of CBP. And Border Patrol has jurisdiction or authority to enforce immigration laws near and between official ports of entry. And so they are the agents dressed in green, like a dark green, that many of us in the border region see driving around in like the white and green trucks or sometimes on quads. And they encounter, they arrest, they detain people, migrants who enter the United States at the southern border. They also staff like checkpoints that many of us here in Southern California are familiar with, like the one along the 5 freeway in San Clemente. And then I'll mention one more agency, and then I'll get to the point here. But the Office of Refugee Resettlement is another component agency of the federal government's Health and Human Services. And the reason ORR is relevant is because it has jurisdiction or authority over basically the treatment and the processing of unaccompanied migrant kids. And so this includes, overseeing the detention centers for unaccompanied migrant kids. And when I say unaccompanied migrant kids, I'm talking about kids who come to the United States without a parent or guardian. So they oversee the detention centers, and they also oversee the sponsorship process for unaccompanied kids. So once an unaccompanied child does come to the United States, if they want to, if their family wants them to be released to their community or family that's already in the United States, they have to go through a pretty onerous sponsorship process that ORR oversees. And I'll just make clear that it was ORR is that agency that Ahilan referenced at the start of the call, under which that a 17-year-old under the Trump administration was denied access to abortion care, and the ACLU and others took that to the courts. But so I'll make the point really quickly to say that for all people who enter the southern border and come into contact with immigration agencies, the very first agency that they come into contact with is CBP. And that's before ICE, and that's even before ORR for unaccompanied kids. And as you know, Tina, and as I'm sure a lot of people on the call know, CBP and Border Patrol specifically are notorious for cruel and inhumane conditions of confinement. This includes, first I'll say that Border Patrol stations and other CBP facilities are known colloquially as hieleras or ice boxes because of their freezing temperatures. But in addition to that, they're known for, keeping the lights on 24 hours a day, giving people grossly inadequate food. It's when you hear about the frozen and rotten burritos, that's what happens in the Border Patrol hieleras. Lack of access to clean water, no showers, no beds, the list goes on. Part of why, part of the reason for a lot of those, for some of those conditions of confinement is that Border Patrol hieleras or stations are designed for, limited time, for people to be in them a limited time for processing. So the idea is like, somebody may have to come into contact with Border Patrol processes them either for release with their networks of care in the United States, or they transfer them to ICE or ORR. In the past, that limited time has been conceived of by the agency as not exceeding, not even 12 hours. But as you know, and as a lot of us have seen over the years, people have been subjected to longer and longer periods of confinement in these really horrific hieleras. And I'll just say, before I wrap up, that I have represented a family of 7, this was 2 parents and 5 young children, who were detained in a Border Patrol hielera for 10 days without showers, the ability to go outside, adequate food, et cetera, et cetera. So thank you for letting me break that down. And as I hope we'll talk about in a second, that gross mistreatment extends. It doesn't accept it extends to people who are pregnant, postpartum, and nursing.
Yeah. Well, talk to me. I always love to ask people what kind of triggered their broader understanding that kind of links reproductive justice and immigration. And I'm curious for you, was there a particular something that triggered the campaign that you've worked on for years that kind of led to your understanding? Because a lot of a focus on ICE, right? But like you're very particularly focused on CBP with your campaign and CBP's treatment of pregnant and postpartum people. So was there some kind of triggering event that led you down this road?
Yes, there was. Before, as Ahilan mentioned, before I was at the ACLU and then here at CILP, I provided high volume direct services to people who were locked up in ICE prisons. And so I was acutely aware of the grave problems associated with people in ICE prisons. But by definition, when you work with people who are in ICE custody, you've come into contact, even though I worked with people in ICE prisons along the US Mexico border. But even so, even then, by definition, once I was working with them, their time in CBP custody had come to an end, right? They had been transferred over to ICE. And so it wasn't until I, moved over and started really closely monitoring the conditions of confinement in CBP hieleras that the magnitude of the problem in border detention became a lot more clear to me. I'll say it's February 2020. I won't forget the day I received a call about a woman who had, by the time when I received the call, she was in the care of the San Diego Migrant Shelter, which is operated by a close partner of ours, JFS, Jewish Family Service of San Diego. And I learned that this woman had given birth in the Border Patrol station just days before that. And that's all I knew. And if I had been satisfied with CBP's account of what had happened, which they memorialized in a press release, I will say, I would be remiss to not mention that, then I would think that it was like, a happy moment where Border Patrol agents acted heroically and helped this woman deliver a baby unexpectedly in a Border Patrol hilera. Spoiler alert, that is not what happened. I ended up speaking with the woman, and I learned that she had, and every time I tell this story, it knocks the wind out of me. So I'm gonna try to get through it, but she had been forced to give, this woman had been forced to give birth at the Chula Vista Border Patrol station in front of what she counted to be like 10 strange men, including Border Patrol agents, while holding on to the edge of a garbage can for support, because that was the only thing that she could use to sustain herself while she delivered a baby into this earth. And the reason that happened, as I learned from her, is because, I guess I'll start by saying, or I'll wind back the timeline a little bit. So she, crosses the border with her husband and her 2 kids. And as they cross the border, which is not an easy feat, it's a pretty strenuous thing that they go through, she goes into labor. And she's experiencing labor, she's experiencing contractions, and the family sees a Border Patrol agent, and they turn themselves into the Border Patrol agent. And this woman, the woman I represent, is in pain and labor and also coughing because she's sick. And her husband plead for medical attention. Please, we need a doctor. My wife, she's pregnant, and so they're pleading. And so, of course, what does a Border Patrol agent do? Rather than take her to an offsite hospital so she could get medical care like any of us should get in a moment like that, they take her to the Border Patrol hilera with her family for routine arrest, detention, and processing. And during that processing, she, begins to give birth, and she delivers the baby into her pants. Her husband helps her actually deliver the baby from there. And so it's at that point that when she delivers her baby, the agents call an ambulance, and she's taken offsite to a hospital to receive treatment. And I'll mention she's taken offsite without her husband or her 2 kids, who are left at the hilera distraught, like wondering if she's okay, and if the baby's okay. They take her offsite. And if that weren't enough, once she's discharged from the hospital with her baby, rather than release the family to their network of care in the United States, which is wholly prepared to receive them at that point, they transfer the mom and the newborn US citizen baby back to the hilera for a night of postpartum detention on a concrete bench with the baby wrapped up in an aluminum blanket. That was a triggering event. I'm actually going to take a moment, and I'm going to ask for Carly's assistance here. We're going to play a never before heard audio clip that this woman sharing that, how horrific this experience was for her. And you'll hear the audio, and it's overlaid on an image, or on 2 images. Those images are of the CCTV footage from the Border Patrol station that were later included in a report from the Office of the Inspector General that outlined a number of deficiencies on CBP's part. But I'll pass it over to Carly to show the video.
Cuando llegamos a la detención, comencé a gritar un médico porque tenía mucho dolor en la boca del estómago por la influencia que me habían detectado y todos los oficiales, que eran como 10, me miraban mientras yo tosía. Sentí que me salió algo en mi parte vaginal y en cuanto me toqué no dudé en decir que era la cabecita de mi bebé, y mi esposo sin pensarlo me bajó el pantalón y recibió a mi bebé, porque la enfermera salió corriendo a traer una toalla porque ni para eso se movieron los oficiales, mientras que mis dos niñas de 2 y 12 años miraban y lloraban. Cuando regresé del hospital me regresaron a detención y con mi bebé, y no fue justo que me hayan regresado yo estando mala de la influencia y me encerraron en un cuartito muy pequeño. Es muy triste todo esto, pero se los comparto porque pues de algo les va a servir. Y estar encerrada en ese cuartito en una cama que no es ni cama, es de lo que es um, es una, ¿cómo explicarles? Es de cemento. Y en esa cama de cemento, pues ahí nos acostábamos mi niña y yo, pero fueron 2 días muy tristes para mí, porque estando encerrada cerca de un baño, mi nena recién nacida, no era lo justo que ellos me hubieran encerrado ahí. No soy animal para que ellos me traten así. Entonces yo les pedía a ellos agua, no me lo daban. Mi bebé ah, llorando que necesitaba pañales, ropita y todo eso, y mi nena pues ahí nomás envuelta pues ni en una frazada, por decirlo así, nomás era pues como un pañal o algo así. Pero pues es algo pues que me duele mucho todo lo que yo pasé, pero pues espero en Dios que cada día mejore la situación, porque no se lo deseo a nadie, ni a las mujeres embarazadas. Primero Dios, que no pasen ellas lo que yo pasé, porque es algo que uno no se le quita de la mente lo que yo pasé, porque yo hasta la fecha yo no he podido superar todo lo que yo sufrí, maltrato y muchas cosas, pero
It's really hard to hear. And she gets at it at the end. And I found that when people when they're willing to share really traumatic stories, it's because they don't want it to keep happening, right? And they use their voice to fight for change. And so talk to me about this campaign, right? So what is the demand of CBP when it comes to pregnant and postpartum people? And talk to us through like what have been some of the challenges of getting CBP to change its policies.
Yeah, thank you. I agree that it is really hard to hear. So when I mentioned that I met this woman right shortly after this incident, I actually went and I met her baby girl, and we talked about what had happened, and we knew that we had to demand justice for her and for her family, because what happened to her was so horrific that we needed to demand accountability. And we also knew that this was probably the tip of the iceberg. This was the case that we knew about. And so if, to me, it was like this case exemplified what is possible in worse terms in these kinds of hieleras, when we don't demand accountability, and when there's such little oversight as there is. And so we knew that in addition to demanding accountability for her and her family, she knew that we had to work to ensure that something like this would never repeat. So we filed a complaint with the Office of the Inspector General, again, delineating the litany of abuses that occurred in her case. We actually worked together with a medical doctor at Stanford, who was extraordinarily helpful and also helping us identify the grave, the medical danger that she was put in. And we demanded justice for her, but we also put forward a series of pretty no nonsense policy changes that the agency could adopt without an act of Congress, within its existing purview, to ensure that this would never happen again. And the top line demand here is that CBP should prohibit the detention of people who are pregnant, postpartum, and nursing for any period longer than it takes to process them for release into the United States, to join their networks of care in the United States. We included some other demands, like when you take somebody in this condition offsite to a hospital, under no circumstances should you return them to the Border Patrol station, after their treatment has concluded. CBP has the capacity to, it has process people in the hospital and release them from there. But so those were our demands. We worked together with her to conceive of them. And we enlisted the support of senators, of congresspeople, of other organizations to, again, enact this policy that to us is pretty no nonsense. And no, it's been more than 3 years that we've worked on this now, and there have been the challenges have been great in many. I'll highlight one, which is after about 1.5 years of this advocacy, CBP came back to us and to the community with a policy change that they said, would address our concerns. And that policy, rather than implement what we told them they should, which is directly responsive to what happened in this case and what we're sure has happened in many others, they enacted a policy in part that provides for the provision of snacks and bassinets and baby formula and milk and juice for people who are pregnant, postpartum, and nursing, and small infants in CBP custody. And of course, that is wholly inadequate, right? And misses the point, which is that these hieleras are categorically unsuitable for people who are pregnant, postpartum, and nursing. But I'll leave it there for a second and I'll pass it to you.
I want to keep talking about CBP, but first, let me ask you, when it comes to, you outlined earlier the kind of unique situation with CBP, which is that people are supposed to be processed through these facilities quickly. It's often not the case, but it's not like ICE where a person can be detained for years, right? So when it comes to the treatment of pregnant people, postpartum people, people who are nursing, like how is it different or not when it comes to ICE, like when it comes to the treatment of folks?
Yeah. So first, I guess I'll say that in general, lest there be any doubt, ICE is also a site of massive reproductive injustice. Like border hieleras, they are spaces of confinement where people are denied bodily autonomy. And as you noted, people are detained in ICE prisons, or they're confined in ICE prisons for far longer than they are in Border Patrol hieleras, which means there are just more opportunities for mistreatment. But we've actually, I co-authored a report when I was at the ACLU documenting the decades of abuse at one such ICE prison, the Otay Mesa Detention Center in San Diego, where we documented decades of this kind of abuse, the denial of adequate medical care resulting in really tragic miscarriages, sexual assault by guards, and other things. And I'll also mention, I briefly mentioned this at the start of the call, but the Irwin County Detention Center, call them forced sterilizations, call them non-consensual, unnecessary gynecological procedures. That went on, as you know better than I do, for years under ICE's watch. And so for me, and I could sit here and I could list out example after example, but for me, that snapshot, I think, encapsulates the magnitude of the problem in ICE custody as well. But it's so I'll say that, and I won't qualify that. ICE is a site of massive reproductive injustice. ICE detention is a site of massive reproductive injustice. And also on this issue, on the issue of the detention of people who are pregnant, postpartum, and nursing, even ICE, for all of its abuse and mistreatment, actually has a policy of presumptively not detaining people who are pregnant, postpartum, and nursing absent exceptional circumstances. And we've, repeated in our advocacy directly with CBP, we have repeatedly cited to this policy change, which I think the agency enacted in July 2021, but it was kind of like a reversion back to an older policy. But they have, maintained, even after everything that happened to our client, CBP maintains its authority and its discretion to continue detaining this population, people who are pregnant, postpartum, and nursing, and their infants and their families, for as long as they or any one of their agents along the border deem necessary. It's particularly illogical in the context or it's particularly illogical here because I won't get too much in the weeds here, but part of the rationale for detaining people in border hieleras, longer for any period longer than it takes to process them, is because allegedly, CBP awaits a decision from ICE on detention. So in part, the logic is they detain people who are pregnant, postpartum, and nursing to determine whether ICE is going to ultimately take them into long-term detention or whether they can release them. But the agency knows that ICE is ultimately going to decline to detain people who are pregnant, postpartum, and nursing, and yet CBP will not adopt that analogous policy.
I can't imagine the frustrations. Well, I can. Because one of the things I wanted to ask you, you're, as a civil rights attorney who works in the immigration space, you know very well how unjust laws can be, but a complicating factor is how laws can be weaponized depending on who's in power, right? Or who the president is, who's in the White House. So when it comes to CBP's policy in particular, I'm curious to hear more about what are the challenges depending on the administration, depending on whatever kind of whims the administration has around immigration. And with this policy in particular, could you kind of walk us through, this has been going on for multiple years. What have the challenges been between, under the Trump administration, for example, and the Biden administration? How are they different? How are they the same?
Yeah, yes. This campaign has extended over 2 administrations. Hope it won't have to extend past the current one, but that remains to be seen. But first, I guess I'll just affirm what's implied in your question, right? Which is yes, it is different to work on this kind of advocacy under an administration like the Trump administration compared to the current administration. Though maybe not in the way that people assume. So this incident involving our client who was forced to give birth at the Chula Vista Border Patrol Station, that happened under the Trump administration. And I'll be forthcoming in saying I haven't heard of something that egregious happen under the current administration, under the Biden administration. But that does not mean we don't continue to see reproductive injustice in immigration and in border confinement. Let me be very clear in saying that we do. Just this week, actually, I learned that last week, a woman who was in her 4th month of pregnancy and came into Border Patrol custody seeking asylum in the United States, she was detained for 8 days in a Border Patrol hielera near McAllen, Texas. And for those 8 days was denied access to basic necessities and resources, the ones you can imagine, and then was summarily expelled back to her home country under Title 42 without being given an opportunity to seek asylum in the United States. That happened under the Biden administration. So, the injustices do occur, but I guess the one way I think about it is that they're less likely to make headlines. And in turn, it's harder for us to garner public support around this kind of advocacy. So on the one hand, I'd say that it's good that we see fewer extreme and egregious incidents, but on the other hand, the injustices continue, and the Biden administration has refused to make this policy change that it doesn't require an act of Congress to implement, and that could prevent these kind of abuses from happening altogether.
Yeah. I'll say as a reporter, I rely very heavily on people like you for information, because I can have some semblance of an idea or a tip, and I can file a Freedom of Information Act request, but it's like shooting them off into a void, especially with federal immigration agencies. I think I have FOIAs from 2016 with CBP that who knows if I will ever receive a response. So one thing I'm really curious about for you as an attorney is, when it comes to these kind of federal immigration agencies that lack accountability, that operate with impunity, how do you access the information that you need to be able to bring claims against the agencies or to be able to kind of build campaigns around? And then when an agency like CBP does announce some kind of policy change, how do you ensure that they're actually doing what they're saying that they're doing publicly? Like, how do you ensure that that's actually happening behind closed doors?
First, I would be remiss to not co-sign on the struggle with FOIAs to agencies like CBP. I think Boyd was a very generous framing of what happens with this amendment. But no, I really appreciate this question because it certainly brings me to a point that is, I think, so critical in my work. And I think it's really critical that we address this, given that we have a lot of law students in the audience. You know, immigration policy can be complicated, and advocating for policy changes can also be complicated. We talk about very technical things like campaign strategies and legal theories and operationability, which I'm pretty sure is a made-up word, but we use all the time. You know, is this change that we're advocating for operationable? And in my view, we don't talk enough about the indispensability of being proximate to the people that we serve and the people on whose behalf we are doing this advocacy. And to me, that is the hands down the most critical piece of the puzzle. So to answer your question, it's by being proximate to impacted people or you know, people who are impacted by these policies that I get a lot of the information that informs our advocacy. It's you know, people who are in ICE prisons right now, or people who are in shelters for asylum seekers. That's how we get that information. It's like, how did we know that, you know, this woman had been forced to give birth in a Border Patrol station? It's because we asked her. You know, she probably showed up at the JFS migrant shelter a couple of days after it happened with her newborn baby. And the kind folks who work there probably asked her something like, "How are you?" And that's you know, that charted us down a path of elucidating what had actually happened. And you know, when they got in touch with us about it, I went directly to meet with her and to meet her baby girl and to talk with her about not just what had happened to her, but about what she wanted to do coming out of an experience like that. And that's true across the board for me. And I think it should be true across the board for most, if not all of us who are engaging in this broader advocacy. Like I do impact litigation and systemic policy advocacy, but I also continue to visit ICE prisons, you know, to visit with people, or to visit shelters for people seeking asylum. From time to time, I take on individual cases for representation, you know, in removal proceedings. And it's a critical component to my work to continue to be proximate in that way. It's what gives us information about what's happening in real time. But to me, it's also what should keep us grounded and committed. And it should be what informs our strategies, our campaign demands, and even the narratives around the work that we're doing.
Yeah, absolutely. People are asking lots of thoughtful questions, so I'll just say I'm only going to take like 15 more minutes, and then we can turn it over to Q&A because they are very good questions. One thing I did want to ask you about is that obviously Roe versus Wade being overturned was really devastating, and so I'm thinking a lot about A, criminalization, and B, what abortion access looks like for undocumented people who live in places where kind of like anti-immigrant and anti-abortion laws collide. And so in the context of your work, can you talk to us a little bit about what your concerns are for people who are detained by whatever federal immigration agency, and what kind of a post-Roe world looks like for them when they need or want abortion access?
Absolutely. I have kind of like a constellation of thoughts that I'll share. One is, I guess I'll state the obvious here and say that the criminalization of access to abortion care will without a doubt, thrust more people into the crosshairs of immigration enforcement and, by extension, immigration prisons. Full stop. And so we should, we should approach that topic, I think, with our eyes wide open about that. But I think, like, zooming out a little bit more broadly, I think the concerns that we have for people in anti-immigrant regions of the country are similar to what we should and can expect from spaces of confinement. The way that I think about it is spaces of immigration confinement are like hotspots for anti-immigrant sentiment, anti-immigrant policies. Again, they're spaces where government agents treat people as less than and as undeserving and as being subject to these cruel conditions. And it's also a space where government agents regularly violate the rights that people do have. And so I think that we should fight for a reality in which people in this country have access to abortion care, regardless of where they were born, whether they're citizens, where they're sleeping tonight, which includes spaces of confinement. But as we fight for that, I think we can't lose sight of the fact that with or without access to abortion care and other reproductive health services, immigration confinement is categorically unsuitable for people with reproductive health needs. And so, the Irwin County Detention Center forced sterilizations happened under ICE's watch. The shackling of pregnant people, the experience that my client had, that happened under CBP's watch. And so I think that reality, coming to grips with that reality, should inform movements towards, limiting, reducing, and ultimately ending the reach of immigration confinement as a function of this fight for reproductive justice.
Yeah. Things are always, it feels like things are always shifting when it comes to immigration policy. Under Biden right now, there's Title 42 still in play. There's the transit ban. Very astoundingly, there's talk of bringing back family detention. Can you talk a little bit about what's going on under this administration and how you kind of seeing it impact reproductive justice more broadly?
Certainly. Yeah, and I think it's really important that we make these connections. I think that any border policies that have any effect other than allowing people who are seeking protection to join their networks of care in the United States and pursue their claims for relief outside of a detained or imprisoned setting threaten reproductive justice. And I'll explain why. An example of this is policies like Title 42 or Remain in Mexico when it was being implemented, which is both of which, in short, trap people in Mexican border cities while they await an opportunity to seek asylum in the United States. These policies cut people off from access to critical resources and services that are often available in the United States, but are not available in the Mexican border cities that they end up trapped in. And an example of this is Al Otro Lado is a Tijuana-based organization that has looked into this intersection extensively. And they've documented, for example, instances of pregnant and nursing mothers who are subjected to sexual exploitation in order to do something as simple as secure housing for their families in Tijuana, while they await, while they're trapped there under Title 42 and they await an opportunity to seek asylum in the United States. They've also documented numerous instances of sexual assault and of lack of access to health and safe and affordable reproductive and infant care in Tijuana, again, while they're waiting to come to the United States as a result of Title 42 and these restrictive border policies. The transit ban you mentioned the transit ban, it's a policy that is going to, if the Biden administration goes forward with implementing it, drastically limit asylum eligibility for anybody who transits through a third country on their way to the United States. And drastically limiting asylum eligibility means drastically limiting access to the benefits that come with, with a protection like asylum in the United States. That will also cut people off from critical services. People with reproductive needs, it will cut them off from critical services. And as we've discussed, the unfathomable rumor or report that the administration is considering reviving family detention or family imprisonment it's just another iteration of expanding the use of these spaces that wholesale deny bodily autonomy to the people trapped in them. So I will say, just like, lest there be any doubt, restrictive border policies threaten reproductive justice, and we should define them as such, and we should oppose and fight them as such.
Yeah. And I will say, it is striking to me that there is overlap between policies under the Trump administration and under the Biden administration. And it is my perception that, I've been reporting on reproductive injustice and immigration since the Obama administration, and it was very unpopular. It did not go over well. And then Trump came into office, and my reporting about the same kind of issues received a lot of attention. And in my perception, some of that has kind of dissipated. It was really heartening to see how Americans mobilized around immigration under the Trump administration. And I feel like even though these really horrendous policies are coming down, I'm not seeing the same kind of mobilization, and that having kind of the public's attention on these things can make a really big difference. And so, kind of in the context of your work as an attorney, how do you see this playing out under the Biden administration? And can you talk to us a little bit about why it's important for the public to pay attention, especially in the context of your work? Like, why do you need people listening to the kind of reproductive injustices and these policies that trigger reproductive injustices? Like, why is it important that we keep paying attention?
Yeah, first, Tina, I just want to say that I hope I also we have an opportunity for me to interview you. You have such a wealth of knowledge, and we're so lucky to have you. You've borne witness, I think, to the way that a lot of this has evolved over multiple administrations, and we're so lucky to have that inform this conversation. I will.
Thank you.
I will step back. But yeah, to answer your question, as I briefly mentioned earlier, that when we first embarked on this campaign back in early 2020, we had the support of senators, of the Speaker of the House, the Congressional Hispanic Caucus, is an unmatched level of support from elected officials and other organizations and individuals. And it was, that support came at a really critical moment in time. I have no doubt that support was critical to ensuring that the Office of the Inspector General would actually conduct an investigation. A lot of, I don't know how familiar folks are with the administration, with the administrative complaint process, but like FOIA requests, a lot of them go into the black hole or the void, and we don't hear back, at least not substantively. And the Inspector General did conduct an investigation, and they did publish a report, and that has underpinned a lot of our advocacy. It's been really critical. And so I will say that momentum came at this really critical moment of the campaign. But yeah, I think as you're mentioning, a lot of that support has dropped off over the years. There's been some satisfaction with some of the policy changes that CBP has enacted, which we maintain are wholly inadequate to address the need of people with reproductive health needs. And I think there's been a lot of other fires, a lot of things that we're all collectively confronting over the last 3 years. And that's been tough, because I think we've seen less movement from the agency, or correspondingly less movement from the agency. But I think I'll just take a moment to acknowledge that collectively, we have been through a lot over the last few years. Under the Trump administration, during a pandemic, an ongoing pandemic, and kind of putting out fire after fire, as you mentioned, of a lot of these policies that we thought maybe were going to be behind us when there was a change in administration, but that we find ourselves continuing to have to fight. And over those years, we have suffered a lot, and we've suffered a lot of loss, and it's been a challenging time. But I think we've also learned a lot, and we're not the same individuals, we're not the same groups, we're not the same coalitions, we're not the same advocates we were 4 or 5 years ago. And I think that, we have kind of like a rolling opportunity to renew that momentum, and to continue fighting, to continue hearing from people like our client who graciously shared her narrative earlier on this call, and to allow that to continue informing our advocacy until we win, because I do believe that it's possible to win these changes that we're demanding, and I don't think we're that far, but it is really critical for people to remain engaged and to know what's going on, and to join us.
Well, let me see. Let me ask you one more of my own questions, and then I can, to be fair, I'll go through them as they came in. Let me ask you, so as we talk about public support, what can people do if they want to support attorneys like you that are working at this really kind of critical intersection around reproductive injustice and immigration? How do they support people like you? How do they continue to stay on top of these issues and stay informed? What advice would you offer?
Thank you very much for asking that question. Yeah, I guess I'll say that there's going to be an opportunity in the next few weeks, for folks to plug into this particular policy campaign urging the limiting or the prohibiting of the detention of people who are pregnant, postpartum, and nursing in CBP custody. We're going to be disseminating like some action items for folks to engage there. But I mentioned that we do this work in coalition, because we can't do it all and we cannot do it alone. And so I think one place to start is for folks to engage with definitely the Center for Immigration Law and Policy, Jewish Family Service of San Diego, and the ACLU of San Diego and Imperial Counties. We'll drop those handles in the chat in a moment, but we distribute a lot of the opportunities to engage, especially on these topics, through social media, because we do think that this is something that people want to be engaged on. And so we should, I think it sounds a little bit trite, but I would say you follow these organizations, and keep an ear or eyes open for opportunities to engage. And then I would be remiss to not say explicitly, if it wasn't already obvious because of your wealth of knowledge and expertise, Tina, that people should also, plug into and follow reporters and highly skilled reporters and journalists like you, who are really plugged into the beat and who report kind of like in real time, almost like in advance of real time, to just remain in the know. And I think it's critical for folks to take action, but I think before that, it's critical for folks to know what's going on, and for that to inform the actions that everybody takes.
Thank you for saying that. Okay. Are you ready? Are you ready for Q&A? There's some very good questions. I am happy with these. Chloe Lynn asked the first question, so we'll start there. What connection do you see between reproductive justice and abolition, especially given the inhumane, cruel, and anti-life conditions of detention and confinement?
Yeah, I think that this is, related to something I mentioned earlier, which is that our fight, I think, for reproductive justice we should fight for a reality in which people have access to reproductive health care needs, including abortion access, in space, in everywhere, no matter where they're sleeping tonight. People should be able to access those critical and often life-saving resources. And also, given our collective understanding, or maybe it's a growing collective understanding, that spaces of confinement are categorically unsuitable for people with reproductive health needs, that should also inform our movements to limit and to end detention altogether. I think both are critical.
This is a very good example of reporters failing to ask the most basic questions, or the most obvious. Can you talk to us about the outcome of the lawsuit related to your client that we heard from earlier?
Yeah, so what we filed in that case was actually not a lawsuit. It was an administrative complaint to the DHS Office of the Inspector General. And we can get into, if we had a little bit more time, I think we would get into sort of the tactical decisions and how advocates decide to go one route over the other. I will just preview it by saying that it's challenging conditions of confinement and CBP detention is pretty, it's pretty hard, and it's definitely hard as a mechanism to obtain, like immediate or real-time resolution for people who are suffering. So I'll say that, but that we filed a complaint with the Office of the Inspector General, and as I mentioned, their office did conduct an investigation, and they did publish a report, which we'll share with the participants after this call, that outlined a number of shortcomings or deficiencies on CBP's part related to not only our clients' experience, but to their tracking and documenting of pregnant people or births that happen in custody and the detention of U.S. citizen babies. But it's like CBP failed to land it, right? So they took those the results of that investigation and they implemented their first of what I hope will be more policy changes, which was to provide for these like safeguards for people who are pregnant, postpartum, and nursing in CBP facilities, which we have repeated and will continue to scream to whoever is willing to listen, are wholly inadequate to address the needs of people who are pregnant, postpartum, and nursing. So that's why, in spite of those, what some might characterize as results, we continue to demand this more total solution.
Yeah. We touched on this a little bit earlier, and it makes me think about just the very overwhelming wild time right after the Dobbs decision, where in various states, things were just in flux, like they were going to court, you could access abortion one day, you couldn't another day. So a year has passed. Can you talk specifically, or what do we know about people who need access to abortion post-Dobbs in ICE detention in states like Texas, for example?
I'm actually wondering, and I don't want to punt this, but Tina, I know you've done some reporting on this. I don't know if you have anything that you're willing to share, and then I'm happy to add on if I have.
Yes. So based on my not as extensive understanding as you, is that people will still have to travel, right? Which then means people probably won't get abortion care. Like if it is overwhelmingly challenging for people now to leave their state for all the reasons, especially if you're undocumented in Texas, to access abortion care, if that creates horrendous barriers and people are just going to be forced to give birth because they can't access care, a very similar thing happens in ICE detention because it's a more extensive process where you would have to figure out, first you have to ask for abortion access, and then you have to figure out how you're going to get transferred to another state. My understanding was before you would even have to pay out of pocket for abortion access. So when all of this compounds, I suppose ICE would say that it's possible, but in reality, I imagine that there are too many barriers.
Yeah, I think the only thing I would add to that is, we've been in this reality only under the Biden administration, which is an administration that has, articulated some commitment to upholding reproductive justice at some levels in the post-Dobbs reality. But I think it's critical to think about, what could happen under a future administration that has a less of a commitment or even a commitment to the opposite, where, access to care in ICE custody would rely on the, cooperation and the willingness of the agency to facilitate that kind of out-of-state access. I think for me that they're open questions, but I think we should keep that in mind as well.
Yeah. What I fear is kind of what happened in ORR custody under Trump and Scott Lloyd, it was unclear why he was put in the position to lead ORR, but then on top of that, his religious leanings were completely gearing who had access to abortion and who didn't. And that, of course, that can be weaponized in horrible ways post-Roe. Astrid Ackerman asked, are there any constitutional protections for pregnant and postpartum people in prisons as opposed to immigration prisons?
That's a really good question, and it's not my area of expertise. But what I will say is that you know, the due process clause of the Fifth Amendment, I think should protect the ability of people to seek a critical and sometimes what can be life-saving medical care while in prisons, but and while in spaces of confinement. But I don't want to speak out of turn, and I imagine there are people with a greater amount of expertise on that.
I'm not an attorney, but I will say it seemed to me in covering both that prison is kind of what ICE ended up doing, right? So like prison was the default, the policies there ended up being the policies in ICE custody. So when you saw shackling, things like that, it started in prisons. Not to say that, legally, I don't know if there are constitutional protections for pregnant people in prison, but I will say that so much of what ICE adopted came from prisons based on reporting that I did previously, especially when it comes to shackling and lack of postpartum care and all of those kinds of things. Can you speak a bit about the role of case managers in detention facilities and if they receive any specific training on abortion access?
I don't know what the extent of the kind of training that facilities offer. I can draw on. I remember when the pandemic started, and a lot of us, including folks, here at CILP and many other litigators, sort of rushed to ensure that we would do everything that we could to protect people who were in ICE prisons during that time. There was this like wholesale gross mismanagement of COVID protocols within these spaces of confinement, where it was just like inconsistent access to things like masks, inconsistent enforcement to mask use, like soap and sanitizer. These were all, I was a part of a team that filed a challenge to ICE confinement during the pandemic in the Southern District of California. So covering the Otay Mesa Detention Center as well as the Imperial Detention Center. And that a lot of that was what informed our pleadings. It was like the people who were in charge, who were tasked with doing the day-to-day operations within the facilities, even if maybe there had been some like guidance that came from higher up, which came a lot later than it should have. The people who had to do it in the day-to-day were botching it. And, whether that's a function of a lack of training or something else, I can't speak to that. I can't speak for the facilities. But just drawing on that, I would say there's probably not adequate training. But again, for abortion access specifically, but again, I can't say for sure.
My apologies, but I want to skip around a little bit because I imagine a lot of law students are watching, and I think this is a really great question if you're able to address it. The immigration system can be such a black box, and it can be really hard for advocates and law students to get their foot in the door. I faced pushback even trying to observe public immigration proceedings, for instance. What tools do you suggest for trying to be present as possible within these spaces, immigration courts, ICE prisons, hileras, et cetera, while also facing so much resistance?
Oh, if a question has ever spoken to me, it's this one. Yeah, I guess one easy answer is that when you represent people in these spaces, when you represent people who are in ICE prisons, for example, one, it's really important for the people you represent, and two, it does open up access a little bit more. But it would be a total lie to say that then gives people unfettered access. But just like a pitch for increasing representation for people who are in ICE prisons and often have a really hard time accessing lawyers who are willing to take cases because the prisons are remote, or you have to wait a long time or what have you. But I think that I just want to acknowledge like the broader point that comes across to me in this question and affirm it. I am a woman of color. I was young when I started practicing. And I have faced a lot of pushback and hurdles. And I, we could talk another day about examples of that. But I think one thing that's really critical is the confidence and the grounding that happens when you know what you came to do. So there's nothing like what comes out of me when I show up, for example, to an ICE prison to represent someone in court, and a guard tells me that I can't go in. It's like, this isn't even about me or you. This is about the person that I came to serve. And so there's nothing is going to stand between me and getting in there. And so we can make this as painless as possible. But I think standing in that confidence and in that grounding and in that certainty of what you came to do, whether it's represent somebody or observe court, or even observe conditions, I think that certainty emboldens me with the kind of confidence to assert my rights and the reasons that I go. But I just want to acknowledge that it can be hard, and it can be especially hard when you're first getting started.
Thank you for that. Sadly, we are coming to an end. I could talk to you all day. It looks like everyone else could too, because we have lots of unanswered questions. But thank you to everyone who posted questions. I don't know if you know Monika, maybe you can ask her the next time you see her. Sorry to do that to you. I've said, hey, email me if you have questions, and then my email box was a wreck. So I will not do that to you, but thank you for all the knowledge that you shared.
And thank you, Tina, for just the wealth of not just knowledge, but experience and reporting that you brought to this conversation. It's very rich.
Thank you.
I want to jump in to thank you both for what was really inspiring and at times difficult and completely fascinating conversation. I learned so much listening to this, and I'm sure that our audience did as well. I want to let people know, anybody who registered for this event, the recording will be available and transmitted to you if you missed a portion of it. In addition, the links that Monika was referencing in the questions, and some of the things also from the chat, like the links to Tina's work, the response to the administrative complaint, which I'm sure a lot of people are going to want to read, that you were discussing, Monika, from your client who had to give birth in the Border Patrol station. All those things are going to be also included in the email that we'll send out to registrants for this event. So with that, I think, I feel like we could listen to this for so much longer, but I think our time has come and we'll close it out. So many thanks to everyone for joining us. This is the last event for the semester for both CILP and Center for Reproductive Health Law and Policy, but we'll be in touch with you all soon and for the coming semester. Take care, everyone.